I've replayed that night over and over in my head, trying to figure out where I went wrong. It's hard not to feel like it was my fault, but the truth is, I never should have trusted him. It started when I was driving back from a work trip late at night. I had been on the road for hours, and exhaustion was hitting me harder than I expected. The rain wasn't helping either, coming down in sheets that made it nearly impossible to see the road. My car started making this awful sputtering noise, and before I could even pull over, the engine died completely. The car just stopped right there on the side of the highway, miles from the nearest town. I remember sitting there for a minute, staring at the windshield wipers, struggling to clear the rain, hoping the car would miraculously start again if I just waited long enough. It didn't. My phone was nearly dead, and there was no signal anyway. The highway was completely deserted, just me and the endless stretch of wet asphalt. I was starting to panic when I saw headlights coming up behind me. Relief washed over me as the vehicle slowed and stopped a few feet behind my car. It was a large van, the kind you'd use to move furniture. A man stepped out wearing a raincoat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He waved at me and asked if I needed help. I told him my car had broken down and that I was stranded. He nodded and said he had some tools in his van and could take a look. He seemed calm and confident, like he'd done this sort of thing before. It felt like a stroke of luck. I stepped aside and let him pop the hood. He tinkered around under the hood for a while, muttering about what might be wrong. He eventually said that it looked like my battery was dead, and that he could jump it if I wanted. I told him that would be great, and he went back to his van to grab the cables. I should have felt relieved, but something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was how he avoided making eye contact, or how he kept glancing around like he was looking for something. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. He was helping me, after all. He came back with the jumper cables and connected them to my car. He told me to try starting it, but nothing happened. He frowned and said the battery was probably too far gone. He mentioned that he could give me a ride to a gas station a few miles down the road where I could call for help. I hesitated, thinking about how many times I'd heard warnings about getting into cars with strangers, but the rain was getting heavier and the highway was as empty as ever. I didn't really see another option. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the passenger seat of his van. The inside smelled damp, like old carpet that had never dried out properly. He told me not to worry, that the gas station wasn't far. He started driving, and I tried to keep the conversation light. I asked him if he lived nearby, and he said he was just passing through. He asked me a few questions about where I was headed, and I told him about my work trip. His responses were short, almost like he wasn't really listening. After a few minutes, he said he knew a shortcut to the gas station and turned off the main road onto a narrow, unmarked one. I felt a pang of unease but didn't say anything. The road was rough and winding, and the trees on either side were so dense that they blocked out most of the light. It felt like we were driving deeper into the middle of nowhere. I started to get really nervous when he slowed the van and said he needed to check something in the back. He pulled over to the side of the road and got out without another word. I sat there, gripping my bag, my heart racing. I don't know what I expected him to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He came back around to the passenger side and told me that one of his back tires looked low and that I should come take a look. He said it in this casual, almost offhand way, but something about his tone made my skin crawl. I shook my head and told him I'd wait in the van. He stared at me for a long moment, and his expression changed. The friendliness was gone, replaced by something colder, something calculating. He didn't say anything else, just walked back to the driver's side and got in. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, and then started driving again. The silence was unbearable, and I kept glancing at the door handle, wondering if I could open it and jump out if I had to. When we finally reached the gas station, he pulled up to the pump and stopped the van. I didn't wait for him to say anything. I grabbed my bag, pushed the door open, and ran inside. The clerk looked up surprised and asked if I was okay. I told him my car had broken down and asked if I could use the phone to call for help. When I turned back to look, the van was gone. Just like that, he had disappeared, leaving me standing there, soaking wet and shaking. I still don't know what his intentions were, but I'm certain they weren't good. I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd gotten out of the van when he told me to. If you ever find yourself in a situation like that, trust your instincts. Sometimes it's better to wait in the rain than to take a ride from someone who seems too willing to help. It all started with my car breaking down in the middle of nowhere. It was late, way too late for anyone sane to be driving on those back roads. I was coming back from a friend's wedding, and my GPS took me on a supposed shortcut that turned into a dark, winding road through dense woods. Just my luck, my car sputtered and died halfway through. I remember sitting there in disbelief, staring at the dashboard like I could will it back to life. But no amount of hope was going to change the fact that I was stuck. I got out of the car to check under the hood. Not that I knew what I was looking for, but it felt like the thing to do. The forest around me was eerily quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt like the darkness was pressing in closer with every second. My phone had no signal, of course, so calling for help wasn't an option. That's when I saw headlights coming down the road. Relief washed over me as the vehicle slowed and pulled up behind my car. It was an old pickup truck, the kind you see in movies about small-town folks. A man stepped out, middle-aged, wearing a baseball cap and a friendly smile. He asked me if I needed help, and I told him my car wouldn't start. He said he could take a look, which sounded like a godsend at the time. He opened the hood and started fiddling with things, muttering about what might be wrong. I stayed back, mostly because I didn't want to get in the way. After a few minutes, he stepped back and said that it looked like the engine had overheated. He told me I'd probably be better off letting it cool down and trying again later, but he offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station in the meantime. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about all the warnings I'd heard about getting into cars with strangers. But then I looked around at the pitch-black woods and thought about the fact that I was miles from anything resembling civilization. He seemed nice enough, and what choice did I really have? I grabbed my purse and locked my car, climbing into the passenger seat of his truck. The interior smelled faintly of gasoline and old leather, but it was warm, and that was all I cared about. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him about the gas station I'd passed about 20 miles back. He nodded and said he knew the one. We made small talk as he drove, mostly him asking questions about where I was from and what I was doing out there so late. I told him about the wedding, and he said it sounded like a nice way to spend a weekend. Something about the way he spoke made me feel uneasy, but I chalked it up to my own paranoia. I kept reminding myself that he was doing me a favor and that I should be grateful. About 10 minutes into the drive, he suddenly mentioned that there was a shortcut to the gas station that would save us some time. I didn't know the area, so I just nodded. He turned down an even narrower road, one that didn't look like it got much use. The trees seemed closer here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. I noticed that he had stopped making small talk and was just staring straight ahead, gripping the wheel a little too tightly. I tried to keep calm, telling myself that I was overreacting. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a smear of what looked like dried blood on the dashboard. It wasn't much, just a few streaks, but it was enough to make my heart start racing. I asked him casually if he had a lot of experience fixing cars. He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice was oddly flat. He said that he picked up odd jobs here and there. Something about the way he said it made me feel like he wasn't talking about car repairs. I glanced at the door handle, wondering if I could jump out if I had to. The truck slowed to a stop in the middle of the road. He said he needed to check something in the back and got out without waiting for a response. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place, my hands gripping my purse like it was some kind of lifeline. He came back around to my side of the truck, holding what looked like a crowbar. He told me that he thought he heard something in the woods and that I should come take a look. I remember shaking my head, mumbling something about staying in the truck. He stared at me for a long moment, his friendly demeanor completely gone. Then he smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. I don't know how I found the courage, but I told him that my husband was probably wondering where I was, and that he'd call the police if he didn't hear from me soon. It was a lie, of course, but it seemed to work. His smile faltered, and he muttered something about it being a shame to waste time like this. He walked back to the driver's side and got in, throwing the crowbar onto the back seat. The rest of the ride was tense and silent. When we finally reached the gas station, he didn't even stop completely, just slowed down enough for me to jump out. I ran inside and told the clerk what had happened, but by the time they called the cops, the truck was long gone. I still don't know what his intentions were, and maybe I don't want to. All I know is that I've never felt that kind of fear before, and I hope I never do again. If you ever find yourself in a situation like that, trust your gut. Sometimes the help you didn't plan for is the help you're better off without. I've been sitting here staring at the blinking cursor, wondering how to even start this. It feels so surreal, like something out of a bad dream, but it happened. It happened to me. Maybe writing it out will help me make sense of it, or maybe it will just serve as a warning to someone else. Either way, here it is. I was driving back home after visiting my parents for the weekend. It was late, later than I'd planned to be on the road, and I was tired. My parents live out in a pretty rural area, so the roads were long and dark, stretching endlessly between open fields and patches of forest. The kind of place where cell service is spotty, and there's no one for miles. I noticed the gas gauge dipping lower than I was comfortable with, but the nearest station was still about 15 miles away. I told myself I could make it, that I just needed to keep going. That was until I felt the car start to shudder. It sputtered a few times before completely losing power, coasting to a stop on the side of the road. I remember sitting there in the dark, my hands gripping the steering wheel, willing the car to start again. It didn't. I didn't know what else to do, so I got out to look under the hood. Not that I'm any kind of mechanic, but it felt better than just sitting there. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just me and the empty road. After what felt like forever, I saw headlights coming toward me. Relief washed over me as the car slowed and pulled over. It was a beat-up sedan, the kind you'd expect to see in a junkyard. The driver got out, a man probably in his late 40s wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He asked if I was having car trouble, and I told him my car had just died out of nowhere. He nodded and said he could take a look. He walked over to the hood and poked around for a bit, muttering to himself about what might be wrong. I stayed a few feet back, trying not to seem ungrateful but also feeling a little uneasy. There was something about him I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me, or the way his hands lingered on parts of the engine like he wasn't really doing anything. After a few minutes he stepped back and said it looked like the battery was dead. He said he didn't have jumper cables but offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station. He said it wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes down the road. I hesitated, torn between the warning bells going off in my head and the reality that I didn't have any other options. He said it would be faster than waiting out here for someone else to come along. I nodded and grabbed my bag from the car. His car smelled faintly of old coffee and mildew, but at least it was warm. He asked where I was headed, and I told him about my parents and how I was on my way back home. He nodded and said it must be nice to have family close by. The way he said it felt off, like he was fishing for something. I tried to steer the conversation toward him, asking if he lived in the area. He said he was just passing through, and that was all he offered. We drove in silence for a while, the road stretching endlessly ahead of us. I kept expecting to see the glow of the gas station lights in the distance, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the hum of the engine. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, realizing we had been driving for much longer than 10 minutes. I asked him if we were still heading toward the gas station, and he said we were, but his voice had a strange edge to it, like he was annoyed I'd asked. Something in me shifted then. That unease I'd been pushing down suddenly felt impossible to ignore. I started looking around, trying to get my bearings, but it was pointless. Everything looked the same out there. I told him I thought I saw a house back the way we came, and that maybe we should turn around. He didn't respond right away, just kept driving, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. Finally, he said there weren't any houses out here and that I must have been mistaken. I told him I'd feel more comfortable if he let me out, that I could walk back to my car and wait there. He laughed, this low, humorless sound, and said it wasn't safe to be out here alone. He said I should trust him to get me to safety. I remember the way he said it, like it wasn't a suggestion but an order. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I reached for the door handle, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. He must have seen me struggling because he said the locks were tricky and that I'd have to wait for him to unlock it from his side. My stomach dropped, and I realized then just how much... I don't know how I found the courage, but I grabbed my bag and slammed it into the side of his face. He shouted, swerving the car, and in that split second, I reached over and yanked the steering wheel. The car veered off the road and into a ditch, coming to a jarring stop. I scrambled out through the driver's side door while he was still dazed, running as fast as I could back toward the road. I don't know how long I ran before I finally saw headlights coming toward me. This time it was a truck, and the driver was an older man who looked just as startled to see me as I was to see him. I begged him to call the police, and he did. When the cops arrived, the car was still in the ditch, but the man was gone. They found a knife under the driver's seat and a roll of duct tape in the trunk. They told me I was lucky to have gotten away, but I don't feel lucky. I feel like I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he told me to trust him. If you're ever stranded and someone offers to help, be careful. Not everyone is who they seem. I've never been one to believe in bad omens or fate, but after what happened last fall, I'm starting to think there are forces out there we can't explain. I wasn't looking for trouble that night, but somehow it found me. I've been replaying it in my head ever since, trying to figure out how I missed the signs. It was one of those nights where everything seemed to go wrong. I had stayed late at work to finish a project, and by the time I left it was already dark. The rain started just as I got onto the highway, a cold, steady drizzle that quickly turned into a downpour. My windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the road ahead was a blurry mess of reflections. About an hour into the drive, my tire blew out. I felt the car lurch to the side, the steering wheel pulling hard to the right. I managed to pull over, heart pounding, and sat there for a minute, trying to catch my breath. I remember looking out into the rain-soaked night, feeling the weight of how isolated I was. The highway was empty, and my phone had no service. Of course it had to happen on a stretch of road with nothing for miles. I got out to check the damage, hoping it was something I could fix myself. The back tire was shredded, pieces of rubber clinging to the rim. I opened the trunk, but the spare tire was flat. I cursed myself for not checking it sooner. My only option was to wait and hope someone drove by. It felt like forever before I saw the headlights. The car slowed as it approached, pulling over a few feet in front of mine. I felt a rush of relief when I saw the driver get out. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a kind face and a sturdy build. He asked if I needed help, and I explained about the flat tire. He nodded and said he had a spare in his truck that might fit. He walked back to his vehicle, a beat-up old pickup, and rummaged around in the bed. I stayed by my car, watching him. Something about the way he moved struck me as odd. He was too slow, like he was deliberately taking his time. I told myself I was being paranoid and that I should be grateful someone had stopped. When he came back, he was carrying a tire and some tools. He said it wasn't an exact match, but that it should get me to the nearest service station. He crouched down and started working, chatting as he did. He asked where I was headed, and I told him I was trying to get home. He said it was dangerous to be out on the road alone at night, especially for someone like me. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I didn't want to press him. It took him longer than I expected to replace the tire. Every now and then he would pause and look around like he was checking to see if anyone else was coming. I asked if everything was okay, and he said it was, but his tone didn't match his words. When he finally finished, he stood up and told me the tire should hold. Then he said I owed him for the trouble. I was taken aback. I hadn't thought about paying him, but I reached for my wallet, figuring it was only fair. Before I could pull out any cash, he said he wasn't interested in money. He said I could repay him by giving him a ride to the next town. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to say no, but he was already opening the passenger door and climbing in. I got into the driver's seat, trying to keep my breathing steady. He said he knew a shortcut and directed me to take a side road I hadn't noticed before. It was narrow and unpaved, lined with tall trees that blocked out what little light there was. I asked if he was sure this was the right way, and he said it was. He told me to keep driving, that it wasn't far. The farther we went, the worse I felt. The road was getting rougher, potholes jarring the car every few feet. I tried to make small talk, asking him about where he was headed, but his answers were vague. He said he had some business to take care of and that he didn't usually travel this way. He kept staring out the window, his fingers drumming on his knee. I told him I thought we should turn back, that I didn't feel comfortable on this road. He didn't respond at first, just kept looking out the window. Then he said there was no point in turning back now. He said we were almost there, and that I'd be fine as long as I listened to him. That was when I noticed the knife on the floor near his feet. It was partially hidden under his bag, but the blade caught the light. My stomach dropped and I felt a wave of cold panic. I told him I needed to stop for a moment, that I wasn't feeling well. He didn't say anything, just nodded, like he knew what I was thinking. When I pulled over, I grabbed my bag and opened the door, pretending I was going to throw up. As soon as I was out of the car, I ran. I didn't look back, didn't think about what I was leaving behind. I ran into the woods, my shoes slipping on the wet leaves. I heard him shouting after me, his voice getting closer, but I didn't stop. I don't know how long I ran before I stumbled onto another road. A car stopped, and the driver asked if I was okay. I told them everything in a rush, barely able to catch my breath. They called the police, but when they went back to check the spot where I'd left my car, it was gone. The man in his truck had vanished. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm certain I was never supposed to make it out of those woods. If you're ever stranded and someone offers to help, be careful. Sometimes the people who seem the kindest are the ones you should fear the most. There was something